Hello, I'm Julie Golding and I'm the EPA Manager here at Active IQ. We're putting together this guidance video for you to enable you to register your apprentices efficiently with all the correct information linked to them. So, firstly, you need to build your employer list. Therefore, the system will generate an ID for your employers which you can link to your apprentice when registering them. So I'm in our test site and I'm logged in as Lee from Winton Gym. The first thing you need to do is go to your employers here on the left. And if you want to input a single employer, you would just click Add Employer. This would bring you to this screen. So you can see you as the provider name would come up at the top. You then type in your employer name, so the company name. Company number is not a mandatory field, but if you do have the company number for the employer, then input it there. Website is not mandatory, but if you want to put it in, you can do. Levy is obviously a mandatory field, so it's either levy payer or non-levy payer. That's extremely important that that is input correctly against the employer. So there's a drop down to select which it relates. Employer reference. This is also a mandatory field. However, this is a reference for you to identify your employers easily in reports. So you do have to put something in there, but it doesn't really matter what you put in as long as something is in that field. The external employer ID, this isn't mandatory, so you don't need to put anything there, but if you wanted to add an additional reference in there, you could do. Contact name. You can have the primary contact in here, or this particular field if there was a secondary contact or a generic contact name, so the reception area or someone different within the organisation other than the primary contact, this is where you would input them. And their email address, fill in the address fields, town, county, postcode, telephone number. Just double check the telephone numbers are correct. And then you move across to standards. Tick the boxes which relate to that employer. Assessment centres ignore, you don't need to worry about that. So the primary user details field is extremely important because this is the access information if you want to give your primary contact at your employer access to EPA Pro records. So the username is usually the email address, so you put the email address in this field and the email address in the email address field. The first name, last name and telephone number of the primary contact. Now you see there is a toggle here. If you didn't want them to have access to the system, you could just turn this off. However, if you do, leave that as green, and you don't need to do anything in this last screen here, so at that point you could save the employer. However, what I would suggest is that you just go back and double check that everything is correct before you click save. Check the details. If everything is good and you're happy, you can then save the employer by clicking this button. So that's how you input a single employer. Now I know that you will have lots of employers, so I'm also going to show you how to import employers with a bulk upload. So you would go to employers here again, import employers, which brings you to this screen. So the action we're going to do is create an employer, as you can see here. So there is a helpers button here. Now you can download an example spreadsheet CSV file to create your bulk upload for employers. So you come across here to create employer. That will download the spreadsheet for you here, which I'm now opening. Okay, so this then brings up a sample CSV file for you, which is a spreadsheet. So you click this here and that will open everything out for you so you can see the full detail. Okay, so the first name, surname, telephone number, email address, this is your primary contact, so you complete those fields. Okay, the next field is for website address, which you don't need to have. You can input it if you like, but if you don't want to, then you can delete that column. Then there's a company reference field. This is the company's house number for that employer that you can input. You don't need to do that because it's not mandatory. Along with the external ID for your employer, that is also non-mandatory, but it's an additional field if you wanted to input any references that you hold for that employer. But I'm going to delete them because we are going to keep this sheet nice and simple. So they are deleted. The employer reference field here, this is a mandatory field. Now this is a field that you can use to input data that will help you recognise your employers quickly. So it doesn't matter what you put in there as long as you put something, okay? The external standard ID field is in relation to the apprenticeship standard ID reference number, and I'll show you where you can find those in a second if you don't have them to hand. The industry sector IDs, you really don't need to worry about completing those, and the assessment centre IDs, you don't need to worry about those, so we're going to delete those two fields. Okay. Now along here you'll see there is another contact email, contact telephone number. This is the secondary contact I was talking about earlier when I was showing you how to input a single employer. If you don't have a secondary contact, you can simply put your primary contact details in there. So unfortunately you do have to fill those in, so that is a duplication if it's the same name. Apologise for that, but it gives you an option of a secondary contact if you need it. So they're self-explanatory: contact name, email, contact number, address, etc., and the postcode. And the last field is the levy payer field. This is also mandatory and must be completed. If they are levy payers, you need to put a number 1 in, and if they're non-levy payers, you need to put a 0 in. Okay, so they're the fields that you need to have completed for your employer lists. Now we're going to delete some of these. It gives you a sample of 10, but we don't need to have that many for purposes of this instruction. Okay, then save. Now you would need to save as and add your whatever you want to save it as. Okay, now this is one that I'd saved earlier, so it has instantly saved. So that is now ready for us to check for upload. Okay, so the standard IDs in here, you would obtain those from EPA Pro. Okay, so you'll see the helpers button here. External standard ID finder. So you can click on that and you can see that the standard IDs are here that you need. So we've got ST0070. We'll use that one. So go back to the spreadsheet. I'm going to take these out because these are the examples. We'll type in ST0070 and the same in the bottom field, ST0070. Okay, so we are going to save this because we believe it is now correct for upload. So we then go back to EPA Pro. We're on our Create Employer and we're going to choose our file and we're going to click Upload. We didn't get any errors come up. If there were some errors, then they would be highlighted in red, and that means that there is something wrong with that field. It could be that the telephone number was incorrect, it took the naught off, or it could be the incorrect apprenticeship standard ID code. But you can simply at that stage and in this page just click on the red field and update it in here, and then it will, when you click out of the field, it will change to yellow, and then you can import again, and hopefully the errors have cleared. If not, there's still something wrong and you just need to have a look and see what that is. You can contact us if you've got an issue, and we'll try and help you solve what the issue is if you really can't work out what the error is. But in this case, there are no errors, so we are ready to import. So we click import. Are you sure? Yes, I'm confirming we're sure. So our 2 records there have been imported. So our employer list there is ready. Okay, so your employer list is built. You're ready to register your apprentices with us on the EPA Pro portal. Now, again, you can do this on an individual basis, which if you've got a lot of apprentices will obviously take you quite some time. So again, there is the bulk upload option. So we'll go to apprentices here. We'll show you a single input, add apprentice. Okay, and again, there is the first name, last name, telephone number field, and email address. It is extremely important that the apprentice details are inputted correctly, because once Gateway has been declared, when that apprentice is ready for assessment, the first thing we need to do is contact the apprentice, and if the email address is incorrect or the telephone number, then that will delay our contact, and that will obviously eat into that apprentice's 12-week window for endpoint assessment, and we do not want to lose valuable time. Okay, so along that journey, obviously it could be a year, 18 months before Gateway is declared. If any telephone numbers or email addresses change in that time, then they do need to be updated in the apprentice detail. So you've inputted the details here. You can give your apprentice access to the system so that they can look at support materials that are available to them, or you can keep this as the toggle as off. Okay, if you want them to have access, you can have it green, but most people have that turned off and just issue the support materials directly to the apprentice. Okay, so that's the first screen when you're inputting individually. And then there's the details tab here. Now I know you have built your employer list previously, okay, but on here there is fields here where you have to put the primary work address for this apprentice, and this is very important as well. I appreciate that this may be the same as the employer list address that you have inputted, but in many cases, and especially within this industry, a lot of the apprentices work for an employer where there are multiple sites that they work from, but there is usually one site where they are mostly primarily. So this is where you input those details, okay? Because when we come to allocate an assessor, we allocate them on the system, and the system will look at this address to see where the apprentice is. And we will then have a list of available assessors for that apprentice. Now, if it's a live assessment, obviously we need to see how close the assessor is to that apprentice. So that is why this is extremely important, that this is completed correctly, because we are using this data in this field to allocate assessors who are closest and best equipped to assess that apprentice. Okay, so company name, site name if there is different name, address fields. This field you don't need to fill in, it's not mandatory, but there's a little explanation there that what you can put in there if you want to, but it isn't highlighted as a mandatory field because there's no star next to it. Okay, so you don't need to complete that. The national insurance number of the apprentice, date of birth, and their unique learner number. Very important that you input that so we can claim certificates. Here you've got your drop down for ILR, other or privately funded, so you need to just indicate there which status would relate to that apprentice. External learner ID, that's if you've got a different reference that you would recognise that apprentice by. It's not a mandatory field, you don't need to complete it, but it's there if you want to. Then obviously male, female, ethnicity here, another drop down, so complete that. If there are any reasonable adjustments relating to this apprentice, you would need to input details here so that we are aware of that and can put the necessary measures in place for when we assess that apprentice. Okay, further on down, the workplace mentor. Now this is the employer contact of who looks after this apprentice in the workplace. Okay, so this is extremely important when it comes to us contacting the apprentice and arranging the endpoint assessment. So the mentor name needs to be in here, job title, telephone number and email address. The on-programme assessor, if it's employer provider, well, obviously that would be the contact who acts as the assessor from the employer, but usually it's the training provider on-programme assessor details that go in here. Okay, they all need to be present and correct so that you can be copied in on communications with the apprentice once our assessor is in contact. So if any of those details change along the journey, they also need to be updated and kept current. Okay, so here is the start date for the apprenticeship. They've got expected and everything here, but you know what the start date is on the ILR. So that is the date that you put in here. Okay, now you will have an expectation of when that apprentice will be ready for assessment. So you're putting a date in there. Remember, they have to be on programme for at least 12 months before they can go through Gateway. So the minimum that you can put in there is going to be 366 days, so a year's time and a day. But if if it's an 18-month apprenticeship, put 18 months, but put what you think is going to be the genuine date in there. That field we recommend that you complete regularly. As you progress through the journey, you'll have a better idea, and if that changes, if it's going to be extended or it might be reduced, please keep that up to date so that we can properly plan our assessors' availability to meet the demand. The expected completion date. So the completion date is when you would expect the apprenticeship standard to be completed with the endpoint assessment carried out. So given they have 12 weeks from Gateway date, that would be the date that you put in here. So 12 weeks from your expected EPA ready date. Then you select the standard that the apprentice is taking in there. That's self-explanatory, drop down. And because you've built your employer list previously, you can click this and it will give you the option to select the employer. So you select the relevant employer to that apprentice. So that is a fully completed record now. And as I said before you click save, I like to go back and just double check that everything is as it should be. Okay, on those two screens. I'm happy that everything is completed, so then I would click save. And then your apprentice is in the system and they will have an ID that the system gives them. Okay. If you want to carry out a bulk upload of apprentices, you would go to your apprentices drop down and click import apprentices. Okay, so here we have the create apprentice bulk upload option. Now again, you can click your helpers to download an example of what you need to put in here. So we are going to create an apprentice. Okay, so let's click on here, open up our sheet. Okay, so these are the fields that you need to complete. We'll take some of them out as we don't need them all in there. Okay, so we've got two examples. So the external standard ID we spoke about previously, so you know where to find those codes. They need to be input here against the apprentice record. The specialism we don't tend to use. There is an explanation about that within the user guide, but it hasn't been used as yet, so we're going to delete it. Your unique learner ID goes in this field. Then you've got the first name, last name. So the external learner ID field is an optional field for you to complete if there's a reference that you hold against that apprentice that you want to input. But we don't need that. so we're going to delete that. Date of birth for the apprentice, obviously extremely important. Okay, the CAN login field. If you want your apprentice to receive an email with their login details, you would put a number 1 in here. Okay, but if you don't, and you're not going to be using that, giving them that facility, then you can delete the column because we're not going to be using it. Okay, so then complete the gender for the apprentice. The ethnicity, you can get that from going back into here and going down to ethnicity codes, and then you can find the codes there. Okay, so they're already completed in there. Reasonable adjustments. If there are any reasonable adjustments, then this is where you need to input the information so that we can act on those. Then the apprentice's national insurance number, email address, extremely important, as I said before, that is very carefully input, along with a telephone number. Please make this a text field as shown previously, so that when you input, the naught is at the front. There you go. The TAS name field here is not mandatory. You can delete that at this stage. Okay, then we come to company name. This is the employer's company name. Site name here, this isn't a mandatory field. So if there was a particular site name that you wanted to put in there, you can do, but otherwise you can leave it blank. The other fields are mandatory, they need completing, so the employer's address details go in here, and this is the primary address that apprentice works at. So if the employer was a council, for example, and they worked at various leisure centres, but they're at one particular leisure centre most of the time, then that would be their primary work address. So this is really important, again, because this is how we allocate our assessors to your apprentice for live assessments based on location. So we need to get the correct location details in here. Okay, here the registration type is your either ILR or other, as explained earlier, and this is the employer ID field. Now this is extremely important because this is going to link your employer to that apprentice. Okay, so when you set up your employers earlier, they would have been given an ID. Okay, now they will be given an ID number with some letters in front. You only input the number in this field. Take the letters off and just input the number, okay? Because otherwise it will throw up an error. It's not a problem if it does, because you can amend it on the error screen just to take the letters off, and then it will accept them. Okay, so the next field is that external employer ID. We don't need that. That's not mandatory. That is your reference to recognise your employer. Okay, then you've got your start date, so the apprenticeship start date, which is on your ILR, your record for the apprentice that you hold for the ESFA, and then the expected ready date for their assessments. So input that as accurately as you can. Obviously they have to be on programme for a minimum of 12 months, and then the completion date would be the completion of the apprenticeship standard once assessed, so that would be 12 weeks after this EPA ready date. Also extremely important, as we said earlier, is your mentor details. This is usually the employer contact, so the mentor at the employers, so the name, the job title, their telephone number and their email address. There are parental consent columns if needed, but we haven't had that as yet. If you do have to have parental consent, then you can use those columns there, but we're going to delete those. The assessor is the training provider assessor, so their name in there, phone number and email address. Extremely important that those details are in there so that you can be included in any communications with the assessor when they contact the apprentice at endpoint assessment stage. Okay, so there's your sheet ready. Okay, so we're going to save the sheet and then we're ready to carry out our bulk upload. So back to EPA Pro, we're creating the apprentice, we're going to choose our file, which is this one, and then we're going to click upload. Okay, because we've correctly input our data into our CSV file, it hasn't come up with any errors. Again, if there were any errors, they would come up as highlighted in red, and then you could have a look at those and correct them. So for example, if you put in a apprenticeship standard code that the employer wasn't linked to, then that would throw up an error. Okay, so you need to make sure that those are correct. So we're ready to import, so we can click import. Are you sure? Yes, confirm. And those records have been imported using a bulk upload. Okay, so that is how you build your employer list, which you need to do prior to registering your apprentices. And I've shown you how to do so on an individual basis and a bulk upload, and also an individual apprentice registration as well as a bulk apprentice registration. Okay, so if you needed to make any amendments to your apprentice records, for example, if you've got apprentices registered with us already and we are missing information from there, such as the mentor details or the on-programme assessor details, or the employer is not linked to that apprentice and the record needs to be completed, you can do that, and I'll show you how. Okay, so we have to go into, obviously you can do it on an individual basis by managing your apprentice and editing. Okay, so you can then edit these details here if you needed to. Okay, now I was saying earlier about the system ID. It's an ID that it gives to the apprentice. You see there's AP-50, and I did say when you come to input it into the spreadsheet, you literally use the number and not the letters, because otherwise it will throw everything. So that's there. So here this apprentice has got their primary work address filled in. It's got all the details that we need, but quite often this is the section which is empty. So you would then input your workplace mentor details here, your programme assessor details here, come down to the bottom and there's a drop down list of your employers, select the correct one and update the user. Okay. If you want to do it with a bulk upload, if you're simply adding your mentor details and your on-programme assessor details and your employer IDs, then we can do that here. So we're going to download an example. Update apprentice is what you're looking at. Okay, so there's a lot of fields in here. Now, if it is just purely those areas that you need updating, then we can just delete the columns that we know we don't need to update. Okay, we must leave that ID there because that is the apprentice's ID, and that's how the system is going to know which records to update. So let's delete all the columns that we don't need. We don't need that column. We'll leave the name there just to keep it so that you can see who it relates to. But we don't need this column. We don't need the date of birth or anything at this stage. This is already completed, so we're going to delete that. Okay, so we don't need this column either. Okay, so we've got your employer name here, site name, address, telephone number, county. Hopefully that is all in there, so you don't need these columns either. This will have been completed earlier. Right, this is the important column. We're deleting that column as well. This is where you put your employer IDs. Okay, so let's delete some of these records because we don't want to be updating all of them. Okay, so we're going to take those out because we need to make sure that the ID is correct so that we can update this without any errors. Okay, external employer ID we don't need these dates, they're already in there, so we're deleting those. We do need the mentor name, we do need the job title, we do need the phone number and the email. We don't need these fields. We do need the on-program assessor name, the on-program assessor phone number and their email address. Very important that all this data here is in the apprentice record and correct. Remembering telephone number fields need to be set as text so that when you input the number it doesn't take off the first nought. Okay, again here. Right, let's have a look. So we need to put our employer ID in. Now I know from earlier that the employer ID was 12. But if you're unsure, remember you can go to this screen and you can go to Employer ID Finder and there's your list of employers. So we're going to use Mitchell Thompson's number. Okay, so all these fields are now complete. Now that is all we need to do to update the information that is missing. So we're going to save. So we're going to change this drop down to Update Apprentice. We're again going to choose our file, bulk Update Apprentice, and click Upload. And because all the data is correct, we've got our apprentice IDs in there without the letters before, just the number. We have got our employer ID number in there, and we have inputted all the mentor details and the on-program assessor details. Everything is correct, so we're ready to import. We click import and confirm. And those two records are up to date. So those apprentices now have everything they need within their record so that when they are ready to pass through Gateway, we have everything we need. Our assessor has got all the correct telephone numbers, email addresses for all parties to be involved in the communications whilst we organise the assessment process, and we know who to allocate and where because we've got the locations correct. So we hope that you will find this process easier now you've got this video guide, but please do remember we are always available to help. We don't want you to struggle, we want to try and keep things as simple and as smooth as possible for you. So thank you for watching the video and good luck.